So, for those of you that don't know Malcolm, he's a musicologist and a pianist. He's honorary associate, a lecturer at the Open University and teaches at the City Literary Institute in Morley College. He's published widely on 19th and 20th first century music, including Beethoven, Wagner and Jewish and Israeli music. Lots of other things to his credit. You can read them in the book. Today, you're talking today about Samuel Alman connecting to the community. And the good news is I managed to find a computer that will play your videos.
Thank you very much, Russell, and my thanks also to ECA, to Alex, Geraldine, and to Matt, who I was so delighted to be able to perform with some of the Alman songs on the first concert. And I actually want to say thank you to everyone because it's been an amazing convention and with wonderful papers and concerts. So, and so many different facets of Jewish music coming all together, which actually leads directly into the topic, because Samuel Alman was a sort of precursor, I call it, in UK of JMI, which is the Jewish Music Institute, sort of a pioneer in Jewish music in many different aspects. I'm sure a lot of his work is known to many of you. And so I want to take a slightly different tack today, and I want to actually ask a few questions about Samuel Alman, and particularly about the reception of his music, which to discuss. Sorry about all the text. I also just want to preface it by saying there are amazing connections with the two previous papers, as I hope we'll see with Goldberg, that he was described as being a sort of preserver of the Eastern European tradition in contrast to the Western European reform. And I think this is a sort of a concept that has been applied to Alman, as many of you will know. And secondly, I'm making use of the amazing resources of the National Library of Israel's Alman collection, which is a huge collection, just as the previous paper made use of the archives. And I wanted to say thank you to the National Library in doing so, and also to Daniel Tunkel, who's here presently, because the collection in memory of his father, which was his father's collection, is currently open to the public only of a few months in London, and has an amazing collection also of Alman, but many other aspects of Jewish music. So it's definitely worth visiting.
Can I clarify, not Shameware, it's at Leo Beck College.
It's at Leo Beck College. Yes, sorry, it's a publicly available at the Leo Beck College Library in London. Right, Samuel Alman is generally recognised as one of the most influential choirmasters and composers of synagogue music in Britain in the 20th century, whose liturgical works for cantor and choir are still often performed. And many of you will know the Shire Bet Hakneset and have sung it, presumably with choir. He's also known as the first ever Yiddish composer of Yiddish grand opera, King Ahaz, which was done already in 1911. And I'm sure many of you know about Neil Levin, who's done an amazing amount of research on this piece and continues to do so. We actually performed extracts of this. It's not been performed in modern day since 1913. But it was performed a few years ago by the Jewish Music Institute in London. Interestingly, Grove Dictionary of Music does not have an entry on Alman, but fortunately I'm in touch with the editor and it's possible I can change that. There is some controversy, and I wanted to start with some controversy because actually 1925 was the year in which his first collection of synagogue music, Shire Bet Hakneset, was published by Yuval, which, if you know, was the sort of publication of the Society for Jewish Folk Music, aka Joel Engel, who was based at that time in Palestine, and it linked with the sort of all the Russian composers of Jewish music. And this was published in Berlin, 1925. It was reviewed in the Jewish Chronicle. And a certain SI, I don't think he didn't publish their whole names, but probably he would have had sort of something thrown at his suit or something if he'd met Alman in the street. He says, he reviews it, and basically says that although, to be kind, musicians would be able to judge the synagogue music book, he says, if this is a book on synagogue music, this could be judged by a musician. But a synagogue music, it will provoke the anger or something else, the anger of those who resent any lawlessness in the use of the liturgy.
Oh man!
Right, now the concept here is that he obviously has some sort of prejudice. He doesn't really talk about the music, to be honest, to be favourable to the reviewer, but he does talk about the text. And he criticises the way the text is set and chooses in two interesting examples, which I believe this is a piece that appeared in 1926, that the Kedusha is set in the wrong way, and that Alman reverses the sequences of the response of the cantor on the choir to make it look as if the cantor is responding to the congregation, sorry. And he sort of confuses the choir with the congregation, in a sense. So that's one thing. And the other thing is he gets on, at this point, about halfway down, to the Sfirat HaOmer is another case in point. And he praises the sort of current Siddur, which restores the sort of good version, and criticizes Alman for setting the wrong text and actually leaving out Psalm 67. And therefore he makes a sort of a little bit of a quip and says it's really intended only for the second night of Pesach, when there will be only a few people in shul, and etc. Anyway, so this leads him to a more serious point, which I think could be discussed, which is that he quotes Moshe Isserlis after the Maharil, who forbids any alteration in the traditional tunes of the community, point one, and that elaborate and intricate music appropriate to an opera oratorio strikes a severe blow at congregational singing. Okay, so there's already, after the discussion this morning, I think there's a lot of sort of interest in that critique.
Prophetic.
I want to contrast that with Volume 2, which appeared in 1938. In Volume 2, which received another Jewish Chronicle review, things were slightly different. Compositions well sung. First of all, it introduces it by saying that Alman's music is now widely known and sung by congregations in synagogues, that it's beautiful, that it displays pure musical sensibility, regard for the Hebrew words, harmonic functioning of the choir as accompanying instrument for the Hazan, some ultra-modern harmonies with counterpoint, he's not too bothered by it, combined with the old Russian Hazanut, which Alman had acquired from his training, as I'll talk about in a second, Nitzi Belzer and Baruch Shor, if he points out. And he concludes that this is music of intense Jewishness and a valuable contribution to the musical liturgy. Now, what had changed in 13 years, one asks, and how representative was actually that first review? Well, we'll have to just look into a little bit of biographical context for that. I'll just add one other thing to the 1930s. What happened in the 1930s was that Alman was commissioned to re-edit the Blue Book, as it's called, Voice of Prayer and Praise, which had, I think, last come out, Daniel will correct me, somewhere around 1890s or 18. I think originally came out in the 1870s. And here he has some very, Alman gets some nice, it mentions that he's been, the choice of the new editor, they managed fortunately to get the honorary services of Mr. Samuel Alman, the choirmaster of the Bayswater, and by this time the Hampstead Synagogue, which he was famously there for over 30 years as the choirmaster. And we can see that there's Mr. Samuel Alman, we discovered the successful endeavour to catch the spirit and reinforce the Jewish choral service, more particularly the very impressive Lulay. Anyway, there's some very nice comments about his writing, and it ends the splendid settings of Mr. Samuel Alman. And it ends also that actually at the end of this book, interestingly, is the arrangement of the Hatikva, which was a particular arrangement probably that Alman used to use in his concerts with the choirs that he conducted and founded. And sadly, he passed away before the State of Israel was declared. But the
Mixed choir.
Mixed choir.
Oh, yes.
Well, we get onto that topic. Yes, good. Okay, so what was it that aroused the criticism and admiration? In dealing with that, this sort of change of heart, I want to ask and suggest three aspects to Alman's work which mark him out as a sort of somebody who connected the shaliach with the tzibur. And one is as a composer. So as a composer for the choir in synagogue, and sort of choir and cantor, but also music for the concert hall. And in what way is his music for concert hall important for connecting? That's a question I would like to raise. Choirmaster. He was the choirmaster for many, many choirs and ended up with the Hampstead Synagogue for 30 years, but before that was choirmaster in the East End. I think all the time trained many choirs. And also wrote for specific cantors in mind, dedicated pieces to them. Also, he was a concert promoter of Jewish music, and in fact was very involved in what I would say is the first pioneer in bringing concerts to public mainstream venues, not only Jewish venues, but places like the Royal Albert Hall, which we'll see in a second. Why did he do all this? Because at the root of it, and one can get this because there's a lot of documentary evidence, or there's some documentary evidence. I've been going to the Jewish Chronicle archives, in fact, and in an interview early on, he's very clear about the fact that he really has a mission. You can see it in his activities, that like the Society for Jewish Folk Music, which started in Petersburg around 1908, 1913, that sort of period, his idea was to promote Jewish culture from its tradition that he got, but in a wider artistic sphere that would be universal in the sense it would be to appeal to a universal audience, but also would, as I say, strengthen the national aspirations of the Jewish people, because at that time that's what needed to be done. So to promote Jewish music to both Jewish and non-Jewish audiences, and a lovely phrase which he comes out with in this Jewish Chronicle interview, to Judaize synagogue music, which I think is a really nice idea. Well, we saw a little bit of it in the rhetoric from the Goldberg about the anti sort of reform, German reform. Okay. Okay, I've done that. So yes, well, just to be a little bit more specific about his concert works, he has a vast output of concert works, particularly folk song settings for choir, which were published by Oxford University Press, and they're in Yiddish and also in Hebrew, and he was one of the pioneers of setting Hebrew poetry in a very early stage of the language, Bialik, Katz Nelson, and various other poets, and we will see in a second, I'm going to be talking about it, a string quartet which he names Hebraica 1930, and a piece called Haftarah. And there's a piece which hasn't been ever revived, and I think should be revived, is this orchestral overture Kishinev. We'll come to that as well. As a choirmaster, he trained and conducted synagogue choirs. As I mentioned, he started with the Dalston Synagogue in 1904, which was just when he'd arrived in Britain. Then he proceeded to the Great Synagogue and ended up at Hampstead Synagogue. And these are the two big choirs, the Halevi and the Hazanim choir, which he formed and were very, I suppose they performed a lot of his music as well as other people's. And then as an educator, I see actually his Yiddish opera is a sort of form of education because it was actually intended to be a Hebrew opera. The idea was it was an adaptation of a Mapu novel based on this sort of biblical style, sort of story of King Ahaz. And he then decided to set it in Yiddish because that would be more readily understandable. And this was the age of when the Italian operas were being translated into Yiddish and performed sort of
Even Wagner operas too.
and Wagner operas. Okay,
Yeah.
that's a good one. I'll see that in a minute later. But
Unreal.
anyway, so this was a concession, and what happened? We've got very good reviews in the national press, and he admitted that he does use traditional liturgical music in one of the scenes. It's the priestly blessing that he actually cites a Jewish source. And finally, I'll just end up with a little thing that in the 1920s, there's a correspondence between Joel Engel in Tel Aviv and Alman in London, where Engel says, yes, I think now I've seen your latest songs, which is two of which Matt and I sang. Matt sang and I played on, when was it? Wednesday. Anyway, and they were performed in Palestine by Mark Raphael in 1925, around 1924-25, and they were published a couple of years later. But Engel writes to praise Alman about these songs, and he mentions, now it's time for you to write a real opera.
Oh!
Use a modern opera, and by that he means, using the full stylistic vocabulary of Alman at this time, but also in Hebrew. So the three big concerts were done in 1928, 39 and 46 in association with the Jewish Chronicle at huge halls in London. The Queen's Hall, famously, where the proms used to take place before it was bombed and they moved to the Royal Albert Hall in 1940, around then. 1939 and 1946, the one I just pointed out a little few details of that. It was a charity concert to raise money for the children of Europe, particularly Poland. 1946. They raised £5,000 in 1946, probably was quite a lot of money. And Simcha Kusevitsky was the cantor, and they were the largest Jewish choir. Of course, who was in charge of that was Samuel Alman. He had so much experience in promoting and concerts and bringing the choirs together, and he was conducting, and I don't know exactly what the program was, but one can imagine. He also organized a series of concerts at the Wigmore Hall in the period 1925 to 38 of his music, including modern Hebrew settings, songs, Palestinian topics, as it were, British Mandate Palestine, and other types of Jewish music, and it was reviewed in the musical press, the musical Times, the Times, and whatever, as well as the Jewish Chronicle, and very nice comments. So, what I read before, these are the comments of the Jewish Chronicle, and I want to match them with serious scholarship by Edelson, who of course mentions Alman in his book, but in that period, 1929, he hasn't yet got to 1938. When he wrote the book, Jewish Music, 1929, he says something about, he asked the question, is intricate modern harmony in keeping with the spirit of Jewish music in relation to Alman's style synthesis, in a sort of critical way? But I found a very interesting study of Alman by Avraham Volz-Binder of around the same period, 1927. And he goes into great detail about a certain Shabbat setting and concludes, in this piece, this particular setting by Alman, we feel the Jewish soul, we hear the Talmudic student at study, and all such other beautiful touches as that Jewish life reveals. So for Binder, Alman was Jewish. And for Edelson, Alman, what was he really doing? Anyway, the question is there. So, what do we know about the influences? Where did all this style come from? We have to talk a little bit about Alman's biography. So, he was born in 1877. I'll talk about that in a second. There are different sources. Some say it's 1878. in Sobolevka in Podolia, currently modern Ukraine. He was the 6th of 14 children. He benefited from the influence of his father Nachum's musicality, his mother Batya's talent for Yiddish poetry, and his grandfather's talent as a rabbi and a chazan. And he was, as a child, already very talented as a singer and composer of synagogue music. He sang as a meshorer in the next town's local synagogue, and also sort of sang in whatever choirs there were. And by the age of 14, apparently, some of his synagogue music some of his music had been performed in various shuls. He then went to the Odessa Conservatory in the mid-1890s and became a yeshiva student of Talmud, hence the comment by Binder. And was also enrolled at the Odessa Conservatory and entered the Russian Army Band, where he was for several years. And just to say, at this point, thanks to Daniel's project of his father's wonderful archives, there's an amazing notebook from this period of his studies, which is in very small script, very small notebook, full of notes of possibly exercises in counterpoint and whatever, and possibly some music, and it's sort of a thing to research from that period before the Kishinev pogrom, which there's an account that he and his brother were caught up in it, in a sense, and fled to, or were in Kishinev and were sort of experienced the pogrom. They were sort of saved. They went to a relative's house, but in the meantime they were sort of shaken, obviously, by the experience, and it haunted him. So that when he came to London the following year, 1904, it must have been in his mind. By 1908, he had written this overture, which he called, like the 1812 overture of Tchaikovsky, he called it the 1903 overture. And there are materials in the National Library of Israel about this piece. So he came to London, and some biographers misunderstand. He got an ARC, which is associate of the Royal College of Music. He didn't study at the Royal College of Music. He studied at the Guildhall School of Music, and he received this in 1910. So he was then a qualified musician, and every time his name appeared, it was always Samuel Alman, ARCM, and composer of King Ahaz. That was how he saw it. Now I just include this thanks to David Praga in London, who gave me this photocopy of the naturalization certificate, where his birth date appears as 1877. So I'm assuming that I'm taking that one as a sort of the year, and he's been accepted as a resident. So here is the feature interview. 25 years as choirmaster. So in 1906 he was already, as I say, in Dalston and in the East End, Philpott Street, also lots of different synagogues where he was writing for. And it sums up a few interesting points in this interview. One is that he was really an activist, and his whole aim was to make Jewish music more well known to the community, but also to the wider community. Okay, we know that. Okay, so now here's Paul, if you're ready for it, and Max, maybe you want to say something about it. Mixed choirs. Those who follow Kol Isha may be right, but there's no difference between women singing from the gallery with men and boys with a men and boys choir, and women singing in the choir. In other words, what he was saying was, in shul, if the boys' choir is singing and people join in, including the women who are in the gallery, what's the difference if they're in the choir singing? So it's an interesting comment, because he's not disregarding the halakha at the time. He's respectful of it, because he says, it might be right. But in essence, this famously, the thing about Alman that always stands out is that the choir in Hampstead Synagogue, where he was for 30 years, was a mixed choir, and the synagogue was an Orthodox choir. Now, when I first started into this subject, there was a sort of generally received opinion, well, it was wartime, they couldn't get the men or something, and then it sort of lingered on. But this shows that it wasn't to do with that. It's ideological. It's a belief that Samuel Alman had, was to be more egalitarian. Now, I just want to contrast it with Sir Henry Wood. Quick thought, because Henry Wood, who founded the Proms in 1895 and ran them until he died in 1944, was very, very in favour of women in the orchestra. Women composers featured a lot on his new music list. And there was, in general, in society, there was a great, as you know, around that time, suffragette, everything. So we've got the sort of social context to take into account, and I think this, as an early example of somebody sort of going for women's rights at that time, Alman stands out, I think, in his ideas. Maybe we can discuss it later. Anyway, so the other thing is that he says, my music is not only for the Orthodox community, but it's for everyone. And he includes reform in the USA, he includes in his statement. So he wants his music to be used widely. This is a preview, I suppose, of the supplements, 1933, of the Blue Book, which he must have been working on at the time. Here is his comment about wanting to bring the influence of Palestine and the developments that were going on there, meaning Joel Engel and the thing, to bring it to the Anglo-Jewish community, and my aim is to Judaize synagogue music. Okay. So now let me a change of topic. The two concert pieces that he wrote that I wanted to sort of give you a little tiny taste of. First of all, the Hebraica Quartet. Interestingly enough, there is no available recording of this piece. There was a conference about 5 years ago in Australia where the quartet was illustrating Jewish music and played two of the movements, and it's online somewhere, but I can't tell you exactly how to get there, but you can probably find it. This is a MIDI rendition of the interesting thing about this quartet. It was performed in the Wigmore Hall in 1931, it has a program. He prefaced, like Beethoven did in his pastoral symphony, each movement gets a title. So the title of the first movement is the theme in the first movement. I've done it slightly wrong on the PowerPoint, but I'll just read them. There are three themes. Gossip in the synagogue, which is what you're seeing in the cello, I think, or the viola cello. Ecstasy in worship, which I don't think we're going to get to on this example, and a dance. So you can see there's a sort of sonata form going on. Second movement, I will get to in a second. So here's a little clip of. This is, I'm afraid, the MIDI version of the gossip theme, and I think the prayer theme as well in the violin. So you can, if you read the music, you'll see there's a little bit more articulation needed there in the gossip theme. It's not quite gossipy enough for me in that performance, but it should be. Oh, sorry. I'll get to the next. Sorry. The next movement is Adagio. It describes the Sabbath atmosphere and reveals the Sabbath bride princess with holy angels heralding the divine presence in the Jewish home, the subject here announced by the cello. That was his manuscript comment, and he gives in the actual, the published score has the sort of just the simple title, the simple sort of thematic title. So here is the Adagio, the Sabbath atmosphere. this one is a bit more fun. The Jewish Chronicle reviewer wrote in 1932 of this work, Mr. Alman has achieved his greatest work so far.
Wow.
The second movement, an adagio, which conveys the Sabbath atmosphere, is perfect in itself and is filled with a brooding sense of peace and quiet happiness. The first movement is intentionally diffuse. And so the performance of the final, so was the performance of the final joyous movement was wonderful. Anyway, so it received a good script. Now, have I got time just very quickly? Do we know?
4 minutes 56 seconds.
Should we just do it at the beginning of the thing? Right, so I'm going to just, so I don't know if Elia is in the audience at the moment. And with your permission, Elia, I'm going to play a short clip of Elia and I playing this piece, Haftarah, in the Magnified and Sanctified Conference in Hanover in 2019. This piece was published in 1934 by Salabert, a major publishing company in France, in their series Mizmor, Collection de Musique Juive. And it was a series founded by, under the artistic direction of Leon Algazi and Vladimir Dick, who were composers who had also published in the series. And this series was aimed at doing what the St. Petersburg School wanted to do, which was to spread, to bring to light different styles of Jewish music from around the world. And the preface was about, anyway, so the interesting thing about this piece, it was published with this, as you see here, a prefatory score to show that this piece was derived from the Ta'amei HaMikra for Haftarah. So it's sort of a little theme here, and this is part of the theme of the actual piece. And here is the cello part, and I've managed to identify basically every single note as being part of the notes that are introduced in that prefatory stave. So not every single note is there. But the structure is very interesting, because from that you get that there are 3 pasukim and a little coda. So we have a sort of soft pasuk at the end of 3 times, and then there's a coda. Now, when I did this original research, I was sort of very interested in this piece, and there is a recording. There's actually a book by, is it Marsha Adelson about Jewish music, and she talks about this piece. But funny enough, she says it doesn't have much bearing with the traditional cancellation or something. And I sort of thought, this is a bit weird. So that's why I did the research, and I found that it fits. So that's the first thing. When you hear it, you'll notice that there's a piano accompaniment, and the piano accompaniment transforms what you'd expect without any accompaniment into a lovely sort of late 19th, early 20th century piece. So it's going to hear the transformation. You have to sort of listen to it as sort of the rabbit and the duck at the same time. You have to sort of be able to hear that traditional tune going on with the accompaniment. So we try. Do you want to get it on there? Is it just the sound? That's the preface. Can we get the sound? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just going to round up because it's really late. I won't.
Very late.
I won't play you this imitation of the shofar in a Yiddish song,
Nope.
but I'll just end by coming back to that original criticism. The reviewer of the critical review of 1926 ends by saying the strength of a service lies in the congregation and not in the choir. A congregation can exist without a choir, but a choir cannot exist without a congregation. A little bit of prejudice. There are thousands of pious souls who can pray and do pray without the aid of music. Melodies can only have a chance of singing divinely for their ears and moving their hearts when the text is not sacrificed to the music, and when age-long prayers, sanctified by sorrow and fortified by faith, are not made the toy of the caprice of the musician, even if and when he be a genius. Well, I sort of detect in that a sort of acknowledgement that Alman is a genius. I'm reading it that way. But, folks, seriously, I don't know who that was. What was the legacy of Alman? Well, 1947, the Samuel Alman Society was founded in order to record his music, but they didn't get around to doing very much. He was going to be appointed, a very, very high appointment about synagogue music by the United Synagogue, but he died, and it never came. His pupil, Mark Raphael, who was a wonderful musician, and his son actually became a very important violin teacher, Roger Raphael, wrote, and Reverend Gershon Boyars, who was the Hazan in Hampstead Synagogue, for whom Alman wrote many things, were very instrumental in the society. And in 1957, there was a big concert of his works. But there's not much being done. I wanted to say that in 1957, there were two tributes in the JC, and one of them was then commented on in a letter. And I just want to read one line of this.
Just the one line, Malcolm.
One line, okay. A great number of Alman's compositions were introduced to the Hampstead Choir, and now form an integral part of services on all occasions.
If we don't stop, I'm afraid the kitchen is
Okay,
to close.
so I was going to end with just to say that his Sim Shalom, which is a really lovely tune, is sung. It's very well known.
Yeah. So I am going to stop you there.
We're going to stop there.
We are running very late. But I want to say thank you very much to Malcolm. Thank you very much.